Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen?
No.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes, you're good.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Then, hi, everyone. Again, my name is Johanna Schick. I'm a PhD student at the University of Zurich, and I'm going to talk about infant vocalizations. So I'm studying language acquisition, and I'm going to talk about infant vocalizations and how they distinguish between declarative and imperative pointing contexts. I'm going to start with giving you a brief background about infant pointing in general. So we knew that infants across cultures point or start pointing around 9 to 12 months, and they use them in declarative and imperative contexts. So these are the main categories that research has established. An example of a declarative point would be an infant pointing to a plane in the sky and just wanting to share their excitement about it. And an example of an imperative point would be an infant pointing towards a glass or a cup, wanting the referent to give them the cup or something like this. And most important for this study is that the majority of the points are not produced in isolation, but also accompany vocalizations. And these vocalizations also are used intentionally, which is supported by the observation that infants not only increase their pointings, but also their vocalizations as soon as the recipient of the pointing does not react to it. So altogether, we do know that infants point, we do know that they accompany them with vocalizations, but we don't know a lot about the acoustic properties of these vocalizations. And that's also what leads me to my research questions. So first, I'm asking whether point accompanying vocalizations are acoustically different in declarative versus imperative contexts. And second, I asked whether the different functions of the pointing act can be correctly interpreted from adults from a different culture without receiving any further information about the communicative context of the point. And to answer these two questions, I used data from a language called Shipibo-Conibo, which is a Panoan language spoken in the Peruvian Amazon, in the Ucayali River Valley, which is somewhere around this orange dot on the map. And they are a rather large community, so they have at least 20 to 30,000 speakers. And they're mainly located in small villages along the river, but there's also a growing community in the city of Pucallpa. And the village you can see on the picture is also the village where I collected my data. So I was looking for children which were still in a very early developmental place, which already still had like a very restricted vocabulary, but were already pointing frequently. So we chose an age range between 10 months and 23 months. And what we found was 4 children aged 14, 16, 17, and 20 months. They all grew up in this specific village. Their parents both spoke Shipibo-Conibo as the first language. And we recorded each child for a whole day, just following them around with a camera. And they also had a microphone placed on their chest. In which way we could make sure that the voice of the child was captured and the distance between the microphone and the voice would stay the same. Yes, using this method, we collected 32 hours of naturalistic recordings, which were then coded by Swiss German speakers who did not understand Shipibo-Conibo. And they based their annotations on the extra-linguistic context, so on the pragmatic context of the pointing act. So they had coding sheets with descriptions of declaratives and imperatives, and they were instructed to code only if the function of the point was very clear and to exclude those where the function was not very clear. So this resulted in 256 points from 4 children. On average, they coupled almost 74% of their points with vocalizations. And this was then the basis for the perception experiment that I conducted in order to answer the research question. So looking at the method in order to test whether there are some kind of acoustically differences between the pointing vocalizations, I conducted an experiment with an audio condition and with an audio and video condition. So the aim of the audio condition was just to simply test whether adult listeners were able to interpret pointing vocalizations from both categories correctly. And the aim of the video condition was to understand whether the visual context of the point also supports the decision and to what degree. So this is an in-between subjects design, and we tested 80 Swiss German speaking adults, so 40 in the audio and 40 in the video condition. And the reason why we chose Swiss German speaking adults was because we wanted to see whether speakers from a completely different culture would be able to interpret the vocalizations correctly. And of course, it would have been ideal to also test Shipibo-Konibo speakers and to compare the results, but in this study, this was not possible, but it might be in the future, who knows. We we put together a stimuli set of 18 stimuli with 9 declaratives and 9 imperatives. We made sure that from each child, there were at least 2 vocalizations in the declarative set and 2 vocalizations in the imperative set. We selected, for the stimuli set, we selected prototypical sounds of both types from the whole corpus. So we made a qualitative analysis of the whole corpus and decided to choose only these prototypical vocalizations because the corpus also included crying-like sounds. So when the infant was like on the verge of starting to cry and pointing imperatively, like it was clearly an imperative point, and it would have made the task much easier to interpret this. So, and there were also vegetative sounds, so we wanted to make sure that the sounds were more or less similar. That's why we chose the prototypes. Yes, so the mean duration of the audio stimuli was 630 milliseconds, and for the videos, they were something around 4.8 seconds. And that's because for the video, we also included 2 seconds of context before the gesture and 2 seconds of context after the gesture, more or less, to give participants also an idea about the context. However, we did not include the reaction of the referent or of the caregiver. So because if there was a reaction, because of course we wanted to the participants make their own decision about the gesture. Yeah, so every stimuli was presented twice, and participants in both conditions were then asked to categorize the sounds or the videos in a 2 alternative forced choice paradigm. And to give you also an idea, so here you can see an example of the video condition. So participants saw a video which was between 4 to 5 seconds, and they could replay it as much as they wanted. But they usually only replayed it maybe 3 times or not very often. And then they were asked to choose one of these 2 sentences. So the response sentence for the declarative situation would be, I want to show you something. And the one for the imperative situation would be, do something for me. And for the audio condition, this looked exactly the same, just without the video. And I would like to give you an idea about the vocalizations as well. So I will play 2 examples from the same child to you. This is a 16-month-old boy, and I really hope you can hear this. So please let me know if you don't hear it. So this would be the declarative. Could you hear that? Okay, and the imperative. So again, the declarative and the imperative. So I think you can hear the difference, or you can hear a difference. I don't want to go into too much detail about the specific acoustic characteristics of the vocalizations, but I think you can say that the declarative one is a bit softer, a bit smoother, a bit more speech-like, and the imperative has like more energy in it, and is also like shorter. Yes, and I'd also like to point out that we are dealing with like completely naturalistic data, which is really great in my opinion, and which, unlike examples from experimental situation, fully represent the characteristics of everyday naturalistic pointings. And yeah, that's just really something I wanted to stress here. And yes, I think we can already have a look at the results now. So on the plot, you can see the participants' proportion of correct responses in both conditions, so the audio condition on the left side and the video condition on the right side. And you can see that in the audio condition, participants chose the correct response in 80.3% of the cases. And in the video condition, they chose the correct response in 88% of the cases. So the performance here was slightly higher. But the results of the statistical analysis also suggest that both conditions were above chance, and also in both types of the points, results were above chance. So yes, they are able to interpret the preverbal vocalizations correctly, but we also see that in terms of the video results, that participants performed better when receiving both the visual and the auditory information about the act, but still not at a perfect level, so only something around 88%. And I think the video results just emphasize the important role of multimodality when it comes to pointing. Yes, and in general, I think the results of the video condition are not very surprising, but I was a bit surprised by how good participants performed in the audio condition after all. Yes, so I think this already leads to the conclusion that yes, adult listeners are able to interpret preverbal point accompanying vocalizations, and that they differ between declarative and imperative pointing acts, which means that the underlying intention of the pointing acts is not only embedded in the social context, but also in the structure of the acoustic signals that accompany the gesture. And second, the information is transmitted across cultures, so adults from a completely different culture understand the vocalizations. So this means that the acoustic properties of these vocalizations contain a rich amount of information, and which are understood by members of a completely different culture. And I think this just shows us that pointing is a very powerful tool for children, and although they're still at a very early stage of development and their communicative tools are very restricted, they use those that they have very effectively and increase their chances of successful communication this way. And there are also two larger concepts or ideas that these results hint towards, which I'd also like to mention. And this is on the one hand that there seems to be a larger preverbal repertoire of communication than previously assumed. So this somehow indicates, or that there is a difference between declaratives and imperatives, somehow indicates that the human language system generates non-semantic acoustic cues during this early stage of communication. And future research should definitely look at a wider range of languages, but also at a wider range of pragmatic contexts, which could give us like super interesting insights to this. So there are maybe more pragmatic contexts that we haven't looked at so far. We know that there have been studies on like cries and coos and also some other types of contexts, which could be interpreted across cultures. But yes, this just hints towards that there are more of these categories that we could have a look at. And finally, yes, since the information is transmitted across culture, there seem to be some universal patterns in the acoustic characteristics of this type of intentional communication, which hints in a much bigger picture, or which might also be interesting in a much bigger picture, in theories of language evolution, looking at the transition from innate primate-like calls to flexible human speech. So in this case, ontogeny might maybe replicate phylogeny, at least to some extent. And this is also just a super interesting direction of the study, which will be worth looking further into. Yes, that's already it. Thanks for listening, and I'd also like to thank my supervisors and co-authors, which are Carmen Tadana, Klaus Zuberbühler, and Sabine Stoll from the University of Zurich and the University of Neuchâtel, and Roberto Tarique from the PUCP in Lima, and of course all the families who participated in the data collection in Cayeria, which were also super helpful. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Hi, thank you very much. Those are really cool data. By the way, I'll introduce myself in case you can't see me. I'm Marisa Casillas. So hi. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more in depth about like what you think is going on theoretically behind these findings. So on the one hand, I guess you had me thinking, where does this universality come from? You've mentioned some acoustic features, but also when you characterize the prototypes of these stimuli, they were actually moving toward emotive type categories. And I'm wondering if here the patterns that you're picking up on actually have to do with inferences that are being drawn through the perceived emotionality of the vocalization rather than some kind of like strictly acoustic type of property, for example, like falling or rising pitch. So that was one kind of question. The other is, of course, I guess related to that. I know you said you picked out these prototypical stimuli for particular reasons, and that some of them might be just way too easy. But I was actually wondering what happens in the distribution outside of these prototypical cases, right? Some of them might show interesting variations. And so I guess I wondered if you had collected data on or could speculate about what happens with those other items, both in terms of your Swiss German listeners, and also what advantage you think would be available for Shipibo listeners when they were making these same kinds of judgments on them. Because I can imagine that these types of universal features that you're identifying might kind of cross-cut listeners in diverse linguistic and cultural contexts, but other tokens of these vocalizations, especially because some, it goes up to 20 months, right, with these kids, might show some community-specific advantages depending on how strongly or weakly they tap into these universally recognizable patterns. So anyway, that's a lot of food for thought, but I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on them. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so both questions are super interesting. I think I'll start with the second one because yes, it's obvious. So if we look at children that are almost like 2 years old, one might think that there are already some language specific patterns in the vocalizations as well. And yes, for this reason, it would be super interesting to test the Shipibo native speakers as well, which we just couldn't do so far. So I'm really looking forward if we are able to do it to see whether there are differences or not. But since we also excluded very few instances of proto words. So some of the older children produced sometimes something like half of a word or something. So you could maybe infer a Shipibo word from it. But since non-native speakers coded it, it was difficult. But we tried to exclude those proto words as well. And I'm sure that in this cases, native speakers would definitely perform better than the Swiss German speakers. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think there might be some language specific patterns. And as far as I know, research is really not like clear about this when the language specific patterns start to kick in for the infants. So yeah, basically don't know. And then about the first question, so this was about the emotions, right? So I think this really works for the imperative category. So I think, or why they also performed so good is because there were only two categories. So there was only the imperative, which was like in the example, very energetic and mostly also a bit louder and stuff. So I think it would have been more difficult for participants if they had to choose between three response options, because then the declarative might have been described in other terms. But I think the emotional part really works for the imperative, if that was the question that you asked. I hope I could answer it a little bit.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk.
Thanks.